He was fired for being too ambitious. In 1909, a young naval officer named Donald Wills Douglas walked out of his superior's office with a letter in his hand and fury in his chest. It said, "Dismissed for lack of discipline." What it meant was simpler. He thought too far ahead. The Navy wanted sailors. Douglas wanted flight. The Wright brothers had conquered gravity only 6 years earlier, but their planes were still fragile miracles, wood, wire, linen, and luck. To most, flight was still a novelty. To Douglas, it was inevitability. He had watched the early biplanes with awe, not because they flew, but because they barely could, and yet they did. He saw not fragility, but potential. He told his commanding officer that aircraft could change warfare. They could scout faster than ships, strike harder, save lives. The officer laughed. "Flying machines are toys," he said. "We are men of the sea." Douglas replied softly, "Then the sea will soon be smaller than you think." The next morning his desk was cleared. He left the Navy in disgrace, but he carried with him the one thing they couldn't confiscate, an obsession. He enrolled at MIT, one of the few places in the world treating flight as a science. He studied lift, drag, and airflow. He spent nights in the school's new wind tunnel, the first of its kind in America, watching smoke curl over wings like scripture written in air. He discovered a simple truth. Airplanes didn't have to fight the air. They could cooperate with it. He graduated top of his class in 1912, his thesis predicting aerodynamic principles that would not be proven until decades later. By 1915, the world had gone to war, and so had Douglas, this time with pencils, not pistols. He joined the Glenn Martin Company, an early pioneer in aircraft manufacturing. It should have been the perfect match. It wasn't. Douglas was an engineer. Martin was a showman. Where Douglas saw precision, Martin saw performance. Where Douglas wanted mathematics, Martin wanted applause. The two men could not have been more different. Douglas once said, "Every plane must be built to last longer than its pilots fear." Martin answered, "Every plane must impress before it lands." Their partnership lasted less than a year. Douglas proposed a new aircraft design, streamlined, efficient, able to carry twice the load on half the fuel. Martin rejected it. He told him, "Airplanes are built by pilots, not professors." The next morning, Douglas was out of a job again. He walked away from the Martin factory without looking back. He was 32, unemployed and furious. But this time he had something he didn't before, proof that he was right. And he was about to build it. Los Angeles, 1920. A sunburned city of oil rigs and orange groves, not yet the capital of cinema, not yet the capital of flight. In a small rented hangar near Santa Monica Bay, Donald Douglas set up a desk, a drafting table, and a conviction. The walls rattled in the coastal wind. The air smelled of gasoline and dust. He called it Douglas Aircraft Company, though at the time it was only him, a part-time machinist, and one broken lathe. He pawned his watch to buy aluminum sheets. He borrowed tools from friends. He drew through the nights until the candles burned holes in his blueprints. He wasn't designing beauty. He was designing reliability. When reporters later asked what motivated him, he said, "I was tired of airplanes being accidents that hadn't happened yet." His first success was a machine called the Cloudster, a clumsy name for a perfect idea. It was built for one purpose, to prove that distance, not daring, was the true measure of flight. In 1921, it became the first airplane in history to carry a full payload across the continental United States without mechanical failure. It didn't crash. It didn't quit. It simply arrived. For Douglas, that was victory enough. The Cloudster didn't just fly. It transformed him from a dismissed dreamer into an architect of the possible. Investors came. Contracts followed. By 1925, his hangar had grown into a campus, and his engineers, quiet, meticulous, obsessive, shared his strange religion that flight was not conquest, but conversation. The 1930s arrived like a storm. The Great Depression had crippled economies, but not ambition. While the world stumbled, Douglas designed. He wanted to make flight accessible, not for daredevils or millionaires, for ordinary people. He envisioned an aircraft that would carry passengers not in terror, but in trust. The result was the DC series, short for Douglas Commercial. The DC-1 was a prototype, a test of balance and aerodynamics. The DC-2 refined it. And then in 1936 came the DC-3, a machine so revolutionary that it would rewrite the physics of civilization itself. The DC-3 could cross the continent in 15 hours without refueling. It could take off on short runways, land in rough weather, and carry passengers in comfort. For the first time, airlines could make a profit without government subsidies. For the first time, ordinary people could cross America in a day. The DC-3 was graceful, efficient, and immortal. Pilots trusted it like family. Passengers adored it. It didn't look futuristic. It looked inevitable. When Douglas was asked what made it so perfect, he smiled and said, "It was designed by engineers, not accountants." He didn't build the fastest airplane. He built the one that never stopped flying. 1939. The world caught fire again. Factories that once built dreams of travel were drafted into service to build machines of survival. The United States called on Douglas. He didn't hesitate. He retooled his entire company in months. Commercial production lines reborn as assembly lines for war. The DC-3, that peaceful symbol of progress, was transformed into the C-47 Skytrain, a cargo plane, a troop carrier, a lifeline. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't fast, but it was unstoppable. Over the deserts of Africa, it hauled fuel and food where trucks could not. Over the jungles of Burma, it carried supplies to soldiers trapped in the green silence. Over Europe, it carried paratroopers through blackened skies and dropped them over Normandy on D-Day. Pilots gave it names: the Goonie Bird, Old Fat Lady, Skytrain, names of affection, not mockery. They loved it because it didn't care about elegance. It cared about endurance. A pilot once wrote, "You can shoot the wings off, burn the tires, rip the skin, and the C-47 will still bring you home." Its engines, simple, overbuilt, logical, could run with half their cylinders destroyed. Its airframe could be patched with plywood and prayer. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to work. In an age of propaganda and pride, it was the quietest miracle of them all. Back home, the Douglas factories became cathedrals of metal and rhythm. Night and day, the sound of rivet guns echoed through the air, a mechanical heartbeat that never stopped. Thousands of men and women worked shoulder to shoulder under the white glare of lamps and discipline. They weren't soldiers, but they were what soldiers depended on. Each time a C-47 rolled off the line, a small plate was attached near the cockpit. Engineered with pride, built with care. Douglas himself wrote that line. He said, "A good airplane isn't built. It's raised like a child with attention and love." When the war ended, the Allies had dropped more than 2 million paratroopers from C-47s. They had flown 4 billion miles, and most of them were still flying, even captured ones. Luftwaffe engineers who studied the Skytrain were stunned. It wasn't complicated. It was consistent. Every wire, every rivet, every joint, predictable, repeatable, repairable. One German officer said quietly, "We built wonders. They built what worked." And in those 6 words, he defined the difference between ideology and engineering. When the guns went silent, Douglas walked through his factories alone. The workers had gone home. The hangars were quiet. Only the echoes of machines remained. He ran his hand along the wing of a newly finished C-47. It was warm from sunlight, perfectly smooth. He smiled and said to no one in particular, "You did your job well." Then he turned out the lights, because his airplanes didn't need him anymore. They already knew how to survive. When peace finally returned, the world found itself scattered. Broken railroads, sunken ships, silent ports. But the skies were ready. The same aircraft that had carried soldiers into war now carried people into the future. The DC-3, reborn in civilian colors, became the lifeline of a rebuilding planet. Airlines in every nation, Pan Am, KLM, Aeroflot, Bow, painted their logos on its wings. It flew mail to the Arctic, medicine to the tropics, and people to places they had only seen in newspapers. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a highway. And Donald Douglas, the man who had once been told to stop dreaming, had quietly built the road. By the 1950s, progress had found new speed. The propeller was giving way to the turbine. The sound of war had become the sound of commerce, a clean, rising hum of jet engines that would redefine distance itself. Douglas led the transition with the same calm precision that had carried him from barn hangars to world domination. The DC-4, DC-6, and DC-7 carried the legacy of reliability, while the DC-8, his first jetliner, brought that reliability into a new era. Sleek, quiet, efficient, the DC-8 wasn't just a machine. It was a handshake between two centuries. For every flight that took off, for every contrail that carved a line through the blue, there was a whisper of Douglas's design, grace disguised as function. Douglas was not a showman. He had no patience for slogans, no appetite for self-promotion. When a reporter once asked what made his company successful, he said, "We listen to the air. It tells us what works." He refused to patent certain aerodynamic designs, believing that aviation should evolve, not compete. His engineers joked that he was half scientist, half monk. He kept his office sparse, one desk, one drafting table, one window. From that window he could see the runways. He watched every first flight personally, not out of vanity, but out of gratitude. He often said, "Every time a new plane lifts off, I feel forgiven for the ones that fell." To him, flight wasn't an achievement. It was redemption, a way of proving that human beings could rise above the limits they created for themselves. In 1967, after half a century at the helm, Douglas merged his company with McDonnell Aircraft. The industry was changing, faster, heavier, global. The new name would be McDonnell Douglas, a fusion of jet and spirit. When asked how it felt to see his name merged with another, he smiled. Names change, wings don't. He retired soon after, not to luxury, but to silence, to the quiet satisfaction of a man who had outlived doubt. Decades passed. The world's aircraft grew faster, louder, sleeker. The DC-3 aged, but it never disappeared. As of today, nearly a century after its first flight, hundreds of DC-3s still take to the air. They carry cargo in Africa, tourists in Alaska, mail in the Andes. Mechanics joke that they'll outlive their grandchildren. The metal may be old, but the math inside it never expires. In 1970, a young journalist visited Douglas's home to interview him for an aviation magazine. She asked, "When did you know you had changed the world?" He thought for a long time, then said, "The day people stopped asking if flying was safe." He paused. "That's when I knew we had taught them to trust the sky." He looked out his window. A jet passed overhead, silent and silver. He smiled and whispered, "She's still learning." When Douglas passed away in 1981, pilots across the world dipped their wings in tribute. At that exact hour, a DC-3 over the Pacific crossed the international dateline. Its captain, unaware of the news, logged in his flight book, "Smooth air all the way. Feels like the sky was built for us." He was right. It was. The blueprint of modern aviation still bears his signature. Every fuselage curve, every cabin proportion, every ratio between lift and drag, all traced back to Douglas's calculations made by hand in that lonely workshop a century ago. He was fired for dreaming. He was punished for thinking too far ahead. And yet his dismissal became humanity's ascent, because progress never asks permission. It waits for no command. It only rises again and again until the sky becomes home.